जो हम ट्रांसलेशन एंड इंटरकल्चरल कम्युनिकेशन के बारे में बात कर रहे हैं, और आज उसका बड़ा ही महत्वपूर्ण विषय है जिस पर एमए के विद्यार्थी तो जानते हैं, उनका एक पेपर भी है, और जेएनयू में होने पर पॉलिटिक्स की बात ना की जाए तो बात अधूरी रहेगी। और ये हमारे लिए और भी सुखद है कि पॉलिटिक्स ऑफ ट्रांसलेशन के सवाल को मैडम ने कुछ अलग पर्सपेक्टिव से, अलग विचारकों के माध्यम से देखा है। हमें बहुत कुछ नया सुनने को, सीखने को मिलेगा। मैं आज के व्याख्यान के लिए प्रोफेसर अलेसंद्रा कॉन्सोलारो जी को आमंत्रित करता हूं कि अनुवाद की राजनीति पर बात करें और उसकी नई दिशाएं खोलें। धन्यवाद।
मैं देखती हूँ कि नए हफ्ते के शुरू में लोग बहुत कम हो गए तो ऐसा लगता है कि शायद कोई प्रॉब्लम है। आप बताएं, आ रहे होंगे। अच्छा, ठीक है। हाँ, नहीं बस तो मैं हाँ, अनुवाद की राजनीति के बारे में बात करूंगी, लेकिन हो सकता है कि मेरी दृष्टिकोण बिल्कुल अलग हो, क्योंकि आप यदि राजनीति सोचते हैं कि हाँ, ये पावर प्ले है जो हमने हम उस पर कुछ बात कर चुके हैं, ये ठीक है। लेकिन यदि पॉलिटिक्स राजनीति मतलब जो जैसे कि पार्टी या पता नहीं क्या होता है, उसका जो अर्थ है वो समझेंगे तो मैं वो भी है थोड़ा सा, क्योंकि मैं अपने आई विल टॉक अबाउट एंटोनियो ग्राम्शी एज ए ट्रांसलेटर। अभी मैं बता दूंगी कि एंटोनियो ग्राम्शी कौन है, लेकिन हो सकता है कि आपको ये नाम मालूम हो। आप एंटोनियो ग्राम्शी का नाम सुन चुके हैं, क्योंकि यहाँ भारत में ग्राम्शी बहुत मशहूर है, क्योंकि सबाल्टर्न स्टडीज ये मतलब सब लोग ग्राम्शी की बात करते हैं। हाँ, लेकिन मुझे पता नहीं कि वास्तव में ये लोग ग्राम्शी पढ़ते हैं कि नहीं। और मुझे मालूम है कि ग्राम्शी एज ए ट्रांसलेटर किसी को मालूम नहीं होता है, तो ये मैं बताना चाहूंगी। फिर हमने स्पिवक का नाम लिया, और and we talked about the fact that for Spivak translation is a political act. So I will just discuss very shortly what is the difference and the relation between both ideas of translation, because Spivak, as you know, was part of the subaltern group, subaltern studies group. So I think it's important to point out also this. And then I will introduce Naoki Sakai, and I will address the notion of heterolingualism and homolingualism, which is really very important when we think of translation as politics. And especially the position that Naoki Sakai proposed. I don't know if you ever heard about this scholar. He's a Japanese scholar, but I will give you all the references of the books that you might want to read later on. So we are also talking about heteroglossia, and I will talk about Jhumpa Lahiri and Gramsci. Now Jhumpa Lahiri आप जानते हैं, एक बहुत मशहूर लेखिका है जो मतलब अभी वो इतालवी भाषा में लिखती है और अनुवाद करती है, इतालवी भाषा और लैटिन भाषा से अंग्रेजी में तो और वो भारतीय मूल की है और बंगाल से है। तो ये मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि एक बहुत अच्छा नमूना है कि हेटेरोग्लोसिया क्या होता है। तो सबसे पहले हम एंटोनियो ग्राम्शी से मतलब परिचय, मैं उनका परिचय दे दूंगी, और So when we speak about politics of translation, it's very important to think of what Gramsci, was thinking when he introduced the notion of translatability. When he thought of translatability, he was thinking about the condition of translation. So the fact that every language and every group, social and cultural group, is in a certain position, and there are deep asymmetries. We have already talked about that, about the differences in, power and hierarchy. Asymmetry means, different positions, among these languages. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. And the concept of translation itself has been politicized and used as a theoretical tool when we discuss notions as nationality, citizenship, multiculturalism, and globalization. I am not going to address this part of the discussion very much, but when we will discuss about heterolingualism, we will see how that this notion is very connected to the idea of identity, of nation formation, of this part of the state level, of usage of language and of translation also. So, Antonio Gramsci Semilie, he was a very important Italian philosopher, Marxist philosopher. He was a linguist, he was a journalist, he was a writer, a politician, wrote on philosophy, political theory, sociology, history, linguistics. His first training was in linguistics, and he spent a lot of time, and then he died in prison because he was active during the fascist period in Italy. I am sure that not many of you know that he was also a translator. And I will talk about that because it's really interesting that the fact that Gramsci was a translator is something that even in Italy was discovered very recently. Anybody knows what are the prison notebooks? This is the title that has been given to the notebooks that he was writing while he was in prison. At a certain point, he got the permission to write, and he would read and write and translate. It's interesting that there are some translation notebooks. I mean, some of the notebooks are translations. But if you see what happened when the prison notebooks were published, interestingly enough, the translations were just not put into the collection. So these notebooks were not considered, they were not included, and for a long time, people didn't really know that they existed. Okay, the people who were working on Gramsci, of course, they knew it, but let's say the common reader, when you buy a copy of the prison notebooks, you are not aware that there was this kind of selection. And why is this? Because at that time, the editorial commission was in the hand of the Communist Party, and according to their vision, Palmiro Togliatti, he sort of thought that this is not important. Translation is not important. What we want to know is what he thought about, philosophy, political science, and so on, but not translation, which tells you a lot about all. Think of what we have said about, the position of translation, of translators, and so on. 25 years later, there was a new edition, and this was done under the patronage of Istituto Gramsci. We have talked about the importance of patrons, who is commissioning the translation. And here, actually, this was the first complete collection. Here again, we don't have the books on the notebooks on translation. In 2007, there is a new edition, and this was done by the Istituto dell'Enciclopedia Italiana. That's the Encyclopedia Institute. It's like a very important institution in Italy. And here, I mean, there was the notion that, okay, this translation should be part of if we want to have really the critical edition, we want to publish what Gramsci wrote, his translation should be studied and taken into consideration. So you can find, some of the, the reference to the notebooks, but I don't know. This is only for those who want to go and read them. What is interesting is that he was translating mainly from German, also from Russian, and something from English. And of course, there are also some translations from Marx. But I call him an apprentice translator because he was really picking up things that he found interesting. He doesn't seem to have like a project in his mind. He's translating what he deems interesting. And for example, he's translating a literary magazine from German that is dedicated to, I mean, it's a special issue on American literature. At that time, American literature was prohibited in Italy. And because, during the fascist regime, America was like the enemy, and so it was not something that one was supposed to read. And what is interesting is that, if you read this translation and then you read also some parts, that of his other notebooks, then, some people who have studied this very thoroughly, they notice that these translations are very much connected to the development of his ideas. So cutting them out is really a very difficult thing to justify, but it's only a translation. So what I'm interested in is to point out that he also translated some folk tales collected by the brother Grimms. You might know that this is a collection of fairy tales that, are very folk tales also, that are very common in Europe, and, all the children grow up listening to this kind of tales. And he wanted to translate them in order to send them to his sons, because his family was in Russia, the wife and 2 sons were in Russia, and he could not communicate with them. There was censorship, he could not really write whatever he wanted. And so it's really interesting to see that he was translating these things in order to communicate with his sons. But we will see what he was doing when he was translating. And then, of course, there is also translation from Russian that, was like, taken into account what was supposed to be good literature, he also translates some of Goethe's poems. So he's really, like, you can see, he's very eclectic. Gramsci translates, as you see, he knew quite a few languages, apart from Indian and Sardinian, because he comes from Sardinia. I should have put a map, sorry, maybe I will add it to the, because Sardinia is a small island. It's small, but not, but it's an island that is part of Italy, but it's, let's say, separated from what they call the continent, so it's really something, and they have their own language, which is really a different language. It's not a dialect. They have different dialects, but Sardinian dialects are like a sort of different language. And Gramsci had studied as a linguist. So in his translation, it's interesting because he's also inserting some words that come from this heritage, you know. So he's really like, you know, mixing different registers. And then, of course, I told you there is also some something, you know, translated from Marx. But I would only like to give you a couple of examples of his translation strategies. He was not a professional translator. He was a politician, a political thinker, but he was a linguist. And in any case, we can consider him a theoretician of translation, because his idea of translatability, I will try to tell you in very simple way. When he thought, when you translate a text, and we could define it like cultural translation. I don't know if it's correct, but you know, what we told about, you know, cultural translation. He said, when you translate something, you know, for example, from the French literature, and this is like, you know, something that is in the context of the French Revolution, you are translating the whole culture of the French Revolution. And you are a successful translation if you succeed in putting all this culture into your final text. So this is the notion of translatability. You know, you should not only like go language word for word, you know, not the Jacobson idea, but the cultural idea of that. So what he does is, I mean, he tries to, you know, so his idea is that you have to give a text that can suggest the culture, where it comes from. But if we analyze what he did with the Grimm fairy tales, we can see that in a way he was also manipulating the text. And I will give you a couple of examples. Translatability means something that can be translated. You know, it's the quality of being translatable. But this is a central idea for his whole political and philosophical thought. So it's not only something related to translation of texts. That's why I say that we can consider him like a precursor, like a pioneer of translation studies. And as I told you, you know, his choices in translation, you know, like he was translating Stalin under the fascist regime. This is really subversive. So it's really like using translation in order to resist, in order to fight. And this is, you know, a political use of translation. Yes.
When he's talking about asymmetries, on the first slide, you talked about issues of power and asymmetries between languages. So if we, let's say, assume a translation from French to Algerian and from Algerian to France, is he also talking about the epistemic erasure that happens with respect to Algeria?
He's not talking about Algeria, but he's talking about the fact. Yeah, he doesn't use this kind of vocabulary, but he's really interested in, you know, pointing out that you are translating a whole culture. So, you know, you have to be careful about what you choose and what you leave. So, but he will not use, you know, this kind of language, because of course this was not something that he would do at that time. And he was mostly interested in, you know, of course, the asymmetric relation between languages, which is like, you know, for example, he was translating from Russian into Italian, or from Italian, German into Russian, you know. So, and then he was pointing out, you know, that, you know, there are differences, and these differences are not merely linguistic. They are exactly the epistemic difference, you know. And of course, he is not, I mean, interested in post-colonial studies. He cannot do anything like that, you know, because we are in the 30s. So, I mean, and he was in prison, by the way. So the selection of books he could access was very limited. So So as I told you, there are all this, I gave you a full reference of this, and I also pointed out that there is a correspondence between some translations and some reflections, some things, some thoughts that are in the other notebooks. So when they, for example, erased these translations from his collected works, this was, for example, something that is related to this. So it's interesting because in prison, at the very beginning, when he was imprisoned in 1925, he says that his priorities are two. First of all, stay in good health. His health had never been very good, so. And then study German and Russian, because his idea is that I want to make language study my predominant activity, and I am sure that even if I'm quoting this because I think this is very important, my state of mind is such, this is in 1929, that even if I were sentenced to death, I would continue to feel calm, and even the evening before my execution, perhaps I'd have a Chinese language lesson. So you see how he's presenting the act of, learning other languages, getting to know different culture, because he's talking about, Russian and Chinese, something that it's not French, which is very similar to Italian. And this is what gives him, a calm mind. So, and translation is something that he's doing because he thinks that this is what he could do in order to be alive, to maintain, his mind active and, calm. So, as I was telling you, translation is not only between languages, it is between two experiences, historical realities, and historical and political configurations. So, translation is a process that allows us to put into action what are the peculiarities, the particularities of both, the target culture and the source culture. So you can see that putting to action is something that we mentioned regarding what? Who was talking about, translation as action? We mentioned this, last time, like feminist translation, and Spivak also, this, the cultural translation and the post-colonial translation. So this is very important because here we are many years before this kind of, scholarly wave. And he says that one has to be inside the concrete reality of the culture. So it's like, you cannot translate something if you don't really know the culture that you are translating. It doesn't mean that you have to have lived in that culture, but maybe you have to have read books, gather knowledge in order to being able to create this translatability, this transposition of one culture into the other. And of course, he's a Marxist, so he's thinking of that as a dialectical process, which is an ongoing process, So for Antonio Gramsci, translation is not equivalence. It is what he describes as correspondence in difference. I like this very much. And so translation maintains the difference, doesn't erase the difference between, languages. And that's why it is a relationship of complementarity, not of equivalence. I don't know if it's clear enough. Is it okay for you? Can you? Okay. So, the translatability of language is something that happens when we take into account the historical conditioning, the material basis that makes it possible for the two cultures national discourses to enter into relationship. We will see that this idea is something that also Sahay will discuss. He will have a totally different approach, but it's interesting that these kind of problems come over and over. So he says, what is translatability? He says that I translated this as two fundamentally similar structures have equivalent and mutually translatable superstructures, whatever the particular national language, which is more or less what I was trying to say. For example, when I said that it's not like the problem of translating French into Italian or Italian into French. It's the very of the superstructure. What is the superstructure? It's like the whole cultural, political, social background that you have to be able to transpose into the new text, the target text. And that's why he says that, of course, there is no perfect translation in the sense of, perfect equality, but there is translatability in the sense of the background. You can have, the background and, make one background enter in a dialectical relationship, a complementary relationship with the other one. And, okay, so for him, translation is thought of in historical terms, and the untranslatable is what is the historical limit of this thing, and that's why he says that the untranslatable is not something like, you cannot translate this term because there is no linguistic equivalent. He thinks of untranslatable as, something that in one time, this term may be not translatable, but in another time, it may become translatable. And this can only happen if the two cultures can enter in contact at the background, at the level of their structure. This means that the very idea of, the original, the translation, the equivalence and so on is not so important, because what makes translatable, for example, he thinks of translating revolutionary praxis. What does it mean? In German philosophy, when we translate a text of German philosophy, we have to be aware that this text is the product of a historical time of the transmission of all these ideas, of the texts that, propagated these ideas, and the very translations that were done. So this is the whole thing that allows translatability. So the focal point when we think of Gramsci as I described, a pioneer of translation studies, is the very notion of the intrinsic relation between history and translation. I will give you all these slides, so don't worry. I mean, they will be available to you. And translation is considered a historical phenomenon. If you think of this, we are really I think it's something that translation studies has really totally debated, I would say, in the third generation. So it's really something that is, I don't know, very, very important. And he was thinking of that in a very early time. And he was like revising the idea that the original does not exist, because the original is not a text that exists in itself. It is the history of the whole culture, texts, and what I was describing, as the two circles, you know, who is doing the translation, who is like, you know, into the patronage of the translation. And history, you know, this happens in different historical times. And so it is, you know, we could say that any text is already translated because it's a product of all these things. And, you know, it's not, translation is not mere communication. It's not an exchange of meaning, you know, but it's really like, you know, a dialectical, and that can be antagonistic, you know, one, the opposite of one, and then, you know, you have the final, the text that is like, you know, the product. So, of course, the real novelty in this idea is the notion that theory and praxis have to be put together. They cannot be separated, which means that he says, for example, you know, this idea of translation as something that you are doing, it's translating revolution, translating action, so translating text and also political ideas and also, you know, standpoints. And, you know, because we are thinking of theory and praxis as something that go together, translation is something that brings about transformation. And this is something absolutely new, you know, because we are in a time when there were people who thought, you know, that there was this, you know, equivalence and so on. As I told you, Gramsci and translation is not only something that is theoretical. I mean, he was in prison and so on, but he married translation because, okay, if we think of a translation as a marriage between texts, well, for Gramsci, this was really a very intimate relation because he met the woman who was to become his wife at a translation, you know, she was acting as an interpreter. They met, you know, and Julia Apollonova, she was Russian, but she lived also in Switzerland, in Italy, and when Gramsci was there in a delegation of the Communist Party, she was the interpreter, and they worked together at the translation of a novel, of a Russian novel, and then in 1923 they got married, and starting from that time, we can say that translation became, you know, part of his life, also because when he was imprisoned and the wife and the kids remained in the Soviet Union, then he would like translate, as I said, some tales for his kids. And that's what I would like to show you a little bit, because when he was translating this, he was really doing a political act, because he wanted, why is he translating these books? He wants to create a connection to his kids. He cannot be, you know, the father that goes there and tells stories before they go to sleep. He's never with them. So he wants to create this bond, and we have repeated, you know, translation creates bond. We have also talked of translation as an intimate act. Okay, this is very intimate also because, you know, it becomes part of his life. But it's interesting because he's also operating a lot of changes. Okay, if we want to use the metaphor of fidelity, he is very unfaithful to the text in certain sense, because he selects some tales, and for example, in the tale of the 12 brothers, which is a tale where, you know, there is okay, the stories that you have a Raja, and he has only male sons, And then when a girl is born, you will not believe it, but he's so happy that he says, I will kill all my male sons in order to let my only female daughter having a grand life. So can you believe it? Okay, this is great. So, but so there is this danger, you know, when another child is born, there is a flag. And when the flag is black, it means that, you know, a sister is born. And this is, you know, danger for the sons. But of course, a black flag during the fascist period, if you don't know, I mean, black was the color of fascism. So, I mean, it was something that was really charged politically. And he's sort of using this thing in order to introduce some meanings that are not definitely in the original text. He's changing the space, and for example, the German fairy tales are all set in a very northern environment. You have, you know, this northern wooded landscape. He describes an Italian landscape, an Italian village landscape. And for example, he changes some animals, like a hare, a wild hare, becomes a hen. In order to make it, so he's domesticating, isn't he? And then what is even more important is that he has a project that is to secularize these fairy tales. He wants his kids to read these fairy tales as something that teach them a certain view of the world. So he is regularly avoiding all the references to God, to Christian religion, and he's like substituting them with other things. If any of you can read German, I gave you the original text and the Italian, and like we have Lieber Gott, which is like, oh, my dear God. It's something related to God. And he's saying like, ahimè, and ahimè is like, alas, something like that. So it's not religiously charged. He's doing this with very regularly. So it's clearly a strategy, a translation strategy. And you might think that this is something that we consider wrong. We have always said you don't have to manipulate the text. He is manipulating the text. But he's doing this because for him, translation is action, and his action, like we talked about the feminist theory of translation, that is like we want, you know, the women presence to be seen. And he wants, you know, his secular vision, you know, to be seen and to be there. So he's doing it. So, okay. So now we try to see what happens when Spivak meets Gramsci. Spivak, well, she's famous because she translated Derrida, but she's, of course, also acquainted with the Marxist theory. She was active in the subaltern studies group, and so, I mean, there is a lot of Marxism. And the Indian version of Gramsci is, you know, something that has to be studied in itself because it's very peculiar. But, I mean, the praxis of translation in Spivak, I think, has a lot to do with what Gramsci was suggesting. Because if you think of what we said, you know, about Spivak suggesting that the translator doesn't have to use the so-called translatese. You know, we use this expression, I think, you know, did I mention translatese? It's like this sort of artificial language of the translation that makes everything dull. And she says makes, I don't remember exactly, but something from, like a man from Philippines and a woman from Palestine look exactly the same, you know. So this is what we have to translate. And, you know, the fact that both at the epistemological, that means, you know, the way we know, you know, and at the thematic level, the ideas of Spivak, I think, are very has a lot to do with the notion of translation and translatability in the idea of Gramsci about, philosophy and praxis. Because for Spivak too, if you only think of philosophy as something theoretical, detached from praxis, it doesn't work. It must go together. And so for Spivak, language and context are very much linked together, and it's not, when we think of the language for Spivak, as for Gramsci, is not only an instrument to describe the world, but it is the world. When she says that she gets immersed in the text, that she has to get this very intimate relations with the text, it means that for her, translation is the world, And so, okay. For Gramsci, the nature of translation reveals itself in the capacity to activate what he calls the creative spirit of the people, and therefore to be able to modify common sense. You see, he's trying to modify the normal reception of fairy tales. He's introducing something different. He's modifying it, Sorry? Yeah, it's an estrangement. But it's a select, because he's selecting the kind of idea that he wants to yeah, so he's exactly. And he thinks that it is through translation that Gramsci conjugates Marxism in a cultural key, affecting a change of paradigm according to a secular and anti-deterministic trajectory, because he wants to propagate this idea. For Spivak, translation, she says, it's an activity of consciousness that moves of itself. This activity, the method of philosophical discourse, structures the philosophical text. When the translator creatively contradicts these exigencies of the structure to appropriate a text, she is pursuing a discourse which borrows from a heritage that necessary resources for the construction of that heritage. A heritage, there is necessary resources for the construction of that heritage itself. So I think this is something, that we can put in parallel, and we can see, that both Spivak and Gramsci, they start from the relationship between language and reality. And this is the point that is really important. And of course, Spivak then gives a feminist turn that we don't find in Gramsci, because she introduces the notion of gender subalternity. Of course, then she has also written about Gramsci, but we have mentioned her book, The Politics of Translation. And of course, here, what you were mentioning is much more present, than in Gramsci. You don't find very much this discussion of the double colonization. But if we think of what he was doing, when he was playing with the use of the language of Sardinian and standardized Italian and foreign languages, in a way he was, doing these things, but he was not theorizing that as translator, But as I tried, I don't know if I was clear enough, but he really tried, to do it in order to introduce a change that would be a political change. So this is what she writes in The Politics of Translation, that the fact that we have this wholesale translation into English, this entering the language of the hegemonic culture. This means for translation practice that the literature of the third world gets translating into a sort of with it translatese, so that the literature here is by the woman of Palestine begins to resemble in the feel of its prose something by a man in Taiwan. So this is exactly, the where Spivak takes us. Is there any question about that? Something that is not clear? Something that maybe... With it translates, this is, the language of Spivak. I don't know if you ever read Spivak. It's a very difficult prose. I mean, I think she's very good at making things difficult when she speaks about things, So but I think it's fine. I mean, you have to read this text many times before you can understand them. It's really difficult prose because she's really full of concepts and she makes up new expressions. What she describes as with it translatese is this sort of flat language, that makes everything that is in English look the same. Somebody was there at the event Saturday at the IIC. I don't know. Oh, it's you. Yeah, sorry, I was looking. And you might remember that everybody was talking. A lot of mention was made of English as a flat language, which strikes me because why is English a flat language? Well, because we are thinking of this kind of English. What the English that makes everything look the same. It doesn't respect the differences in language, culture, the epistemic difference, that is there. And so, I mean, when you use this language, all the erasures and all these things become invisible. So you are really making everything flat.
There is a homogenization in English.
Yeah, but okay, watch out. It's not only in English. We are very aware of this phenomenon regarding English. But think of what happens when when you translate into Manak Hindi, something that comes from other different aspects of Hindi, and I'm only mentioning Hindi, but I think we can do it for any kind of standardized language. Even in Italian, I can give you thousands of examples of that because, we know that, every language has different differences, okay? And when you go to the standardized national representation of the language, then of course this is what you get. For English, it's even, more visible because we know it's the global language and so on. Okay, so translation, of course, is something where we can have the politics of translation and also the politicization of the concept of translation. So it's of course, as we were just mentioning now, with translation we can modify, we can introduce changes, and so translation can be productive but can also be destructive. Can be like inscribing, erasing, redrawing borders. This is all what we can do just doing translation. I think this is what you had in mind when you asked the first question. And of course, this kind of theorization you don't find directly in Gramsci's writing. You have to think about, his notions of translation and translatability, and you will find a lot of interesting points that are related to this. But he's not writing book on that, of course. So, at this point, the very act of translation is very ambivalent because it can be used in order to promote a change, to be political, like the feminist translation theory says, but it can also be used in order to manipulate text and, like foreignizing text in order to, I don't know, manipulate them for other purposes. And, so we can say that translation is something that cuts both ways, and that's why I'm always, when somebody says, but this is right, or is this right or wrong? It depends. You don't have like a unique, something that is always like that. And Gramsci is very interesting for that because he says, everything is historically created. So you have to see actually what happened at the historical level. So translation can be something that dominates or can be something that liberates. And here is the political aspect, you know. So this is very important. And in recent years, I think there is a lot of debate about, you know, the notion of translation regarding the concept and the institute of the border. You know, because translating is crossing a border, a linguistic border, a cultural border. It is always like, you know, challenging the border. The translation happens in the interstice between two languages, you know, because of course you have A that goes into B, okay, but it's not so simple. We have repeated this very often. So this notion of the border, that, you know, we have the metaphor of the bridges, you know, when you have a bridge and you're also creating walls when you have a border. So this is also, this has been debated in the context of the global world. And I think of the global world as a global place where goods can travel, money can travel, finance exchange can happen freely, but people, what about migrants? What about the walls that are being built everywhere, you know, and so on and so forth? But okay, so, and here is where I introduce Naoki Sakai. He starts with the critique of Jacobson's taxonomy, you know. So who remembers the three kind of translations that are, you know, recognized by Jacobson? Intralingual, interlingual, intersemiotic. Okay, so I don't know, so it's great. So he said, and according to Jacobson, which is the only proper translation? The interlingual, A to B. This is the only one. Naoki Sakai says, well, you know, this is not really correct, because translation, I'm quoting, it always inscribes itself in the social topos of incommensurability and difference, and what I specifically call cultural difference, to which translation is a response, is anterior to and fundamentally heterogeneous to the conceptual difference of species, the difference between particularities. This is a concept that is maybe not very something that we understand immediately, but his idea is that languages do not really exist in a separate way. And that's why he says the practice of heterolinguistical address evoked in me, what it evoked in me was not the sense of peculiarity of writing for two linguistically different readerships. Rather, it made me aware of other social and even political issues involved in translation, and it illuminated what I had long suspected about the assumptions of the non-heterolingual address, namely the homolingual address. Now, this notion of the address is something that maybe, okay, I will finish to read this and then I will come back to this notion. Strictly speaking, it is so not because two different language unities are given that we have to translate. I mean, it doesn't mean that we have to translate because we have Hindi on this side and Italian on that side. And because they are there, we have to translate. It is because translation articulates languages so that we may postulate the two unities of the translating and the translated languages as if they were autonomous and closed entities through a certain representation of translation. What does he mean? That what we think of two different separate languages, actually, it's like a secondary construction. And when he thinks, you know, the homo lingual address is the notion that, you know, there is one monolithical form of language that embodies, like for example, the nation, embodies the identity. But this is nothing, it's not something that really exists, it's something that we make up. So, he thinks of language as a non-homogeneous entity, and what he describes as the address is not the communication, but the very, when you address somebody, it's like, you know, you start going towards, you know, and so if we think of two different languages, we think of one language A as a homogeneous language and language B as a homogeneous language. And this is the problem, according to Sahay. So, what he describes as the modern regime of translation, you know, it's what came into being because of the creation of the nation state. Now, if you remember what I was trying to say when I was describing the process of standardization of Hindi and Urdu, this is exactly what Sahay is saying in a very, you know, theoretical way. But if we think of that, it's like there is this multilingual setting, and there is like a very porous passage from one level to the other, you know, and so on and so forth. But slowly we create the notion that there is language A and language B, Hindi and Urdu. But in order to do this, we have to think of Hindi as a homogeneous language. We have to standardize it. And when we do it, we are erasing all the local speeches, which is not only dialects. We are also erasing Awadhi and Braj, for example, that I would not define as dialects. They have a long literal tradition. I mean, so I mean, we can't just discard them as dialects, okay? But any kind of dialect in any case. But this is the process, and this is what Sahay points out, because he says this creation of a homolingual regime, he sees that it's something that happens when the language and the nation state get together. And in fact, we see that this happened in the process of creation of the notion of the Indian nation. So we have to find one language for the nation. You see what happens? Okay, so I am just, you know, connecting to something that was said before. Any question?
So when he's talking about translation as an act between two homogeneous entities that he pointed out, is he also thinking of overlaps are also being erased? Like in the example of Hindi and Urdu, there is an overlap.
Yeah.
And that is being erased.
Yeah, but this is not, this cannot be accepted. And that's why you created these two different entities. But he says, translation, I mean, is not something that happens because there are language A and language B. Translation happens because there is this heterogeneity, and then, you know, we have to act, to do something without this homogeneity that is prescribed by what he calls the regime, you know, the homolinguistical regime of the nation state. So, as I was, I put a slide in order to okay, I will just go, you know, address, here you have all the definitions, so you will be able to go back to this. So, can we say that a heterolinguistical address is also a multilingual address? I don't know, maybe, I don't know if you would accept this definition, but the multilingual setting that we have described, for example, for Hindi and Urdu, you know, before this separation, then, because you see, when you create this homogeneous language, you are like, you know, this, you are destroying the multilingual thing, because everybody has to stick to the standard language. So this is the problem. So what he says is that we have to think of multiplicity within the language. Not, multilingualism doesn't mean a multiplicity of different languages, homogeneous language. It is multiplicity in one language, within one language. Okay, so we have Hindi and the different varieties of Hindi. Okay, and of course, he stresses that what we have today is the regime of homolingual address, and he's really describing this very interesting regarding what happened to Japan and the translations, in Japanese, and the way Japanese language was standardized in a certain way. So this process, of course, is a process that can happen only when we dehistoricize language. Because in order to create this homogeneous language, then we have to dehistoricize the language, which is exactly what Gramsci said that we should not do. So you see why I'm, putting this together. And of course, this creates, when we dehistoricize, then we can have the impression that translation comes after. There are the languages, so we have translation. Then we have translation as something that is outside. It's not inside the process. And then, of course, we have the binary between the source text and the target text. So okay. I will just quickly go to this because I also want to talk about something different. And this is a poem by Bertolt Brecht. You know who is Bertolt Brecht? He's a very famous German poet, writer, drama player, and so on. And I will give it to you. You just read it at home. We are not going to read it, but or if you want, we can read it, but this will take some time, and I don't know, maybe we can come back to this later. In this, he moved to the States, and so that's why he's discussing about the problem of language and immigration. So you see, I'm coming back to the notion of translating, migration and all these things. And the fact that in order to be recognized as a citizen of a nation state, you have to pass an exam. You have to show that you know the language. So what happens when heterolingualism, which is this multiplicity within the language among different languages, enters the practices that protect the homolingual attitude of the nation state? And this is about a man, a migrant that comes and he doesn't know the language. So he keeps on failing the exam. And, I will just, he keeps on saying, whatever he's asked, he will reply 1492. It's the only thing he will reply. So he keeps on failing. And then, at his fourth appearance, the judge gave him the question, when was America discovered? Because the judge is always the same man. So he knows what is going on. And on the strength of his correctly answering 1492, he was granting his citizenship. So you see, now we have the homolingual condition of the state that prescribes something, and the judge who is part of this system. But this practice is, somehow challenged by the very judge himself, because heterolingualism enters into this. And this sort of heterolingualism is not only related to the fact of knowing English, of knowing the language. It's a meeting of two individuals, two cultures, and it's at a different level. So I just wanted to leave it to you. You read it and you think about that, and it's food for thought that I think will be good for you. So we have the notion of heteroglossia, which is, the fact that, it's, having more languages. And of course, it's also code shifting and all these things, hybridity. We have, touched all these things. But I want to go to this video. Oh, can I play a video? Will the people at home be able to see it? Okay.
Magnifico rettore, care professoresse, cari professori, carissime studentesse e carissimi studenti, porgo oggi a voi, agli organi accademici, al Dipartimento di Interpretazione e Traduzione dell'Università di Bologna, la più antica università d'Europa, il mio più felice e sincero ringraziamento per il conferimento di questa laurea ad onore. Vorrei anche ringraziare Luigi Groschi e Cristina Foschini, i miei editori italiani, nonché cari amici, per essere qui con me. E ringrazio con tutto il cuore mio padre per avermi accompagnata dagli Stati Uniti fino a Bologna. Ora, purtroppo, mio padre non riesce a seguire tutte le bellissime parole, i discorsi di oggi, quindi ovviamente stasera tocca a me tradurre tutto, però per ora so che mi sta seguendo e perdonatemi se faccio un piccolo saluto direttamente a lui. Baba, tu mi dici, sono che hanno bisogno allora c'è, a tutto robbi, a ciò che c'è, a Gianni Gemma, o perché ciò che c'è.
Okay. You know who this woman is? Which languages she's talking into and where she is? Just guess.
Italian and Bengali.
She's an Italian and Bengali woman. Okay. And where are we? The setting? US? Okay, but I mean, she's wearing something that is okay. So it's something very official. We are in a university, and this is Jhumpa Lahiri in Bologna University. She was given the laurea ad honorem for translation and interpreting in the famous. Bologna is the oldest university in Europe. So she gave her speech in Italian, but at a certain, she is not Italian, but she speaks in Italian, and she's thanking her father who accompanied her from the USA to Bologna, and then she switches to Bengali. But you might know that Jhumpa Lahiri, when she started writing, which language was she writing in? She was writing in English. So when we think of, heteroglossia and heterolinguism, this is the thing, We are talking about something like this. It's not only because she's switching languages, but because she is, okay, just a minute. So I'm going to, I was really fascinated by the fact that during her speech, when you get a laurea ad honorem, you have to give, lectio magistralis, your speech, a very formal speech. She chose to talk about Gramsci. And this is really fascinating, because she chose to talk about Gramsci as a translator. So you see, it's really something that fascinates me, the fact that she is somebody who, I remember that, I heard a lot of critical persons regarding the fact that, oh, what does she know about India? She has never lived in India. She claims she's Bengali, but she's not even Bengali because she cannot write in Bengali, And then, you know, but she writes in English. And then she got fascinated with the Italian, and well, she's rich enough to be able to, you know, move to Rome with the whole family. Not everybody can do it, but she chose to do it. I mean, she came to Rome. She spent a lot of time in Rome, you know, living there. She started writing in Italian and then translating from Italian into English. And it's interesting because she didn't want to translate herself. And she says, you know, that she thinks of this, you know, being, you know, between Italian, English, among, you know, all these languages, as something that, you know, puts her in connection with different languages. And it's very nice the way, the metaphor that she chooses to describe, you know, the other language, you know, the foreign language, because, you know, her language, she says, it's not English, it's the language of my, you know, going to school, you know, this like intellectual thing. But I also have the language I speak to my father, for example, which is a different language, you know. And so English remains the dominant language, you know, with the good and bad meaning. But then there is Italian. And how do I reach to Italian? She imagines as, you know, like getting into a lake and you have to swim. And there is the risk you will drown because, you know, you have to. And so for many years, she just swam, just bordering the kinara kya hota hai अंग्रेजी में? The bank, okay. and then she decides, okay, I will cross it. And then she starts swimming. And that's, you know, what happens when she moves, for example, to Italy in the real language. And she uses an English that is not really full of Indian words. Her English is very standard, you know, it's not really a very mixed English, you know, like the chutneyfied English. It's not like that. In Italian, she does not mix anything. She uses a very standard Italian. And then, you know, she says that, you know, I don't want to translate myself into English. And here's the whole quote of, you know, when she speaks about that, because she said, you know, I don't think, she says that for her Italian, there is this metaphor, you know, that a motherly metaphor, that Italian for her is like a small kid that you take into your arms, you sing lullabies. English is like a teenager, you know, a smelly, hairy, and rough teenager. So if you put them together, she says, I will not be able to manage, you know. And then, you know, it's like, it's not that you don't love one or the other. It's just two different kind of songs, you know, and so you cannot love them. You love them the same, but in a different way, okay? And then she's like, you know, giving a lot of references in her speech about Gramsci. The title of her speech is Traduzione straordinaria, extraordinary translation on Gramsci. I think it was also published, so I think you can get the book somewhere also in English. And she thinks of, you know, the fact that Gramsci was a prisoner, but he was translating. There is a meaning of traduzione. Traduzione is the Italian word for translation. But there is a technical meaning of traduzione, which is the act of carrying one captive person from one jail to the other. We call it viaggio di traduzione. It's a translation journey. So, and she said that she was so fascinated by the fact that he was talking about, you know, the fact that viaggio di traduzione. And when she was reading this, she thought translation journey. What has translation to do with this, you know? And then she got interested in this idea that language and prisoners are in transit. They are going from one place to another. And so she started, thinking about that, and she started, studying Gramsci and so on. And so she's mentioning the fact that, Gramsci had, came from this small place. He had his training was very, diverse. He studied many things. And and she finishes saying that, if we decline more generally the word translation, Gramsci did, whether consciously or not, a series of valencies of which linguistic is only the first, followed by cultural, historical, philosophical, practical, and I would argue also emotional. I want to stop here because I remember that some days ago, the fact that translation is also something that has to do with emotions. It came up. And so we will come back to this when we will describe, when we talk about, what does it mean to be a translator, and so on and so forth. But as you see, also Jhumpa Lahiri is, mentioning the fact that for Gramsci, these were all the things that get into translation. And I think it's really fascinating. I don't know, I brought you along all these different people, but as you see, we are all, involved in the act and in the thinking on translation. And why is this all political? Because, as I said, it's something that changes what we are, the world where we live, and, what we are experiences. So I will just stop here. I think we have some time for questions, and I put a lot of references, so you will have a lot of books that you can read in the future if you want. So
धन्यवाद मैम।
Yeah.
आप सभी के प्रश्नों का स्वागत है। आप में से जो प्रश्न पूछना चाहें।
They are too bored.
नहीं सर मैं और जैसे झुम्पा लहरी की बात आपने कही कि वो बंगाली न ही वो बंगाल में रही है और सिर्फ बंगाली माता पिता होने के कारण ही ट्रांसलेशन या बंगाली अस्मिता को दर्शाती है, तो क्या किसी क्षेत्र विशेष के माता पिता होने से उस क्षेत्र का ट्रांसलेशन करने से क्या प्रभाव पड़ता है? हाँ, झुम्पा लहरी के पर्सपेक्टिव में, जैसे कोई व्यक्ति इटैलिक ना जानता भी ना हो, एक दो शब्द जानता हो, लेकिन फिर भी वो इटालियन में ट्रांसलेशन करना चाहता हो, तो उससे क्या प्रभाव पड़ता है?
I don't know if I got your question right. I'm trying to repeat it. So, are you meaning that Jhumpa Lahiri is not really a Bengali because she's only, but then she's talking about India, and she's writing about India, and you are asking if not knowing a place is some, but you can. The problem is not. एक मिनट नवीन जी मुझे नहीं, मुझे बस एक मिनट, बस मेरी बात
सवाल स्पष्ट कर दे रहा हूँ।
अच्छा,
इसने ये पूछा कि आपने जो कहा कि झुम्पा लहरी बंगाली नहीं जानती थी और उनके माता पिता बंगाल में बंगाली थे, तो ऐसे व्यक्ति यदि इटालियन में ट्रांसलेट कर रही हैं और बांग्ला की चीजों को कर रही हैं, तो इस पर क्या प्रभाव पड़ेगा? ऐसा ही कहा आपने?
Okay, the problem is that you as I said, you have to get some knowledge of what you are translating. You don't have to be from that place, but of course, Jhumpa Lahiri in her fiction, she was talking about India, even if she grew up outside India, but somehow, this doesn't mean that you cannot write about these things. The fact is that, for example, if you want to write about Italy, you are free to do it in creative writing. If you want to translate into Italian, you have to learn the language. And when you learn the language, you also have to learn the culture. It's a different thing, because Jhumpa Lahiri was not translating into Bengali. So in her writing, in her creative writing, she was, describing things that happened in India. And this in creative writing, anybody can do. Why shouldn't you do it? It's creative, it's fiction. But when you translate, if you translate from Bengali to Italian, you must know both Bengali and Italian to a certain level, So the influence, what kind of influence? Of course, as we have said, the cultural knowledge, the fact that you are acquainted with both cultures allows you to translate, a text, a Bengali text into Italian. If you don't know, you might not understand properly, you might, manipulate the text, you might, okay, but I think it's a different thing when we think of creative writing and translation. Because what she was doing, I don't think she has ever translated into Bengali. She is translating into Italian, for example. And as I said, her Italian is very, very neat, very nice, It's standardized, yes, she doesn't use any form of dialect but she is using it in a very, stylistically very nice way. Because, okay, when I say that using the standardized language is dangerous because you could flatten everything, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't use standardized language. It's just when you translate, you have to be aware of, the different levels. But if you are a writer, I think a writer, then you don't have to be Indian to write about India. You don't have to be Italian to write about Italian, right? But if you translate into Italian, if you translate into Hindi, you must know not only the grammar, you must know also, the general context, the history, society and whatever, because, if you translate an Indian text, it's different if you translate, I don't know, a book by, an essay by Ramchandra Shukla or a kahani by an Adivasi writer. It's Hindi, but it's two different things. So if you only know the grammar, you might miss a lot of things. But this is for translation. But if you are talking of writing, then, the influence, it depends. There are some people who are in Italian. Now we have a lot of writers who we call them second generation because, for example, they were born in Italy, but their parents are from Kerala. And there are, also in Switzerland, everywhere, now the world is like that. And they will write in Italian. And of course, not all of them speak only of, being, I don't know, the son or a daughter of a migrant. They can also describe other things. But, it may happen that they describe their own environment, and so they also write about these things. So, I don't know if I replied to your. It's okay? Okay.
बात तो अभी भी आप सुन ही रहे थे, ये भी सुनी सुना ही बात है, पर उसको समझते कितना है। कोई और है सवाल?
मेरा एक सवाल है आपसे।
मुझसे? भाषण तो मैडम ने दिया है।
नहीं सर, वो आप
से बताइए, नहीं तो जो लोग आकर
ठीक है। जैसे सर कविता का अनुवाद के ऊपर, कविता के सृजन के ऊपर आपने बोला था कि नागार्जुन बाबा ने एक बार बोला था कि मैं उस भाषा की कविता कैसे लिख सकता हूं जैसे मैं वहां पर कभी गया ही नहीं। तो सर अनुवादक के लिए भी है कि हम जैसे भाषा सीख लें लेकिन हम कभी उसी परिवेश में गए नहीं, तो क्या अच्छे अनुवादक के लिए भी है कि उस परिवेश को जानना जरूरी होता है, वहां की यात्रा करनी? और ये मतलब कविता के अनुवाद के संदर्भ में सर पूछ रहा हूं।
मैं समझता हूं कि अभी जो अलेसांद्रा मैम ने जवाब दिया इस बच्चे के सवाल का, उसमें आपका भी जवाब शामिल है, मगर किसी विधा विशेष के अनुवाद के लिए ही नहीं, किसी भी अनुवाद के लिए, जैसा कि मैडम ने अभी कहा ना कि केवल ग्रामर जान लेना। अभी तो ग्रामसी के बारे में पहले तो मैं, यदि और किसी को सवाल नहीं है तो 2-3 बातें जो आज हमने बहुत ही विलक्षण ढंग से रेखांकित किया है कि इक्विवेलेंस को एक तरफ क्या कहते हैं इनका, नायडा क्या कह रहे हैं और ग्रामसी क्या कह रहे हैं। इक्विवेलेंस पर इनका कोई विश्वास नहीं है, उनका घोर विश्वास है। पर दिक्कत यह है कि किसी भी समय में, एक जगह मैम ने उल्लेख किया है कि अनुवाद 2 भाषाओं के बीच नहीं, 2 अनुभवों के बीच होता है, 2 ऐतिहासिक संदर्भों के बीच होता है, 2 ऐतिहासिक राजनीतिक सांस्कृतिक प्रभावों के बीच होता है। वहाँ से आप कैसे एक भाषा से दूसरी भाषा में ले जाते हैं, केवल ग्रामर के द्वारा नहीं, इन सारे अनुभवों के द्वारा। मैम ने अभी फिर से दोबारा कहा कि जब तक आप मूल भाषा के और लक्षित अनुदित भाषा के सांस्कृतिक परिवेश को, आबो हवा को नहीं जानते हैं, उसकी ध्वनियों को नहीं पहचानते हैं। एक दिन इधर से किसी ने मैडम से सवाल भी किया था और उसमें इस बात पर ज़्यादा जोर दिया था मैडम ने जवाब देते हुए कि भाषा में ध्वनियों का भी बहुत ज़्यादा महत्व होता है। तो कविता का अनुवाद जब कभी किया जाने लगेगा तो गद्य में बहुत सारी ऐसी चीज़ें हैं जो विस्तार से कहने की संभावना रहती है। पद्य में, कविता में कोई भी कवि जब से तुकबंदी को कविगण नहीं लाते हैं कविता में, और ये फ्री वर्स जब से आने लगा है तब से ये और ज़्यादा महत्वपूर्ण हो गया है। मीनिंग बिटवीन द वर्ड्स, बिटवीन द अल्फाबेट, बिटवीन द सिंबल्स, पंक्चुएशंस के बीच भी अर्थ होते हैं। कुछ चीज़ें छोड़ दी जाती हैं। कवि इतना विश्वास करता है कि मेरा पाठक इतना बुद्धिमान है कि वह कुछ बात को अपने से समझ लेगा। समझने के लिए जरूरी है उस संदर्भ को जानना, उस परिवेश को जानना। ये जब तक आप नहीं जानेंगे, मेघ बजे दादुर के कंठ खिले, यह कविता जो नागार्जुन की है, तो वहां पर असल में नागार्जुन क्या कहना चाह रहे हैं? मेढक बोलने लगा, बारिश हुई, उससे तो नहीं हो जाएगी बात। बात तो तब पूरी होती है जब उसके संदर्भ को आप जान रहे हैं कि वहां शोषक और शोषित, इन दोनों के बीच में, 2 ऋतुओं के बीच में, ग्रीष्म समाप्त हुआ है, बादल गरज रहा है, अब बारिश होगी, और मेढक वहां शोषितों का प्रतीक है जो मिट्टी में दबा हुआ है। उसको जमींदारों ने, उसको शोषकों ने दबा रखा है, और बारिश के आने की संभावना मात्र से उस दादुर के कंठ खिले। ये सारी बात जिस भाषा में कही गई है, उस भाषा के संदर्भ को जाने बिना आप समझ नहीं सकते। सभी लोकगीतों में, बांग्ला में एक गीत है, अब बड़े लोगन बेटी को लामी लामी चूल। इसका मतलब ये केवल नहीं है कि है ना जी, ऐसा ही गीत है ना, तो उसमें किसी बंगाली लड़की के लंबे लंबे जो बाल हैं, इसकी बात नहीं कही गई है। आपने सुना है जो फिल्मिस्तानियों ने तो खराब कर दिया उस गीत को, पान खाए सैया हमार, मलमल के चुनरी, क्या, हाँ, मलमल के चुनरी पर होठ लाले लाल। ये किसी लड़की द्वारा, ये मलमल के कुर्ते पर होठ लाले लाल, ये अंग्रेजों के विरुद्ध लिखा गया यह लोकगीत था। वो एक गीत है जिसको फिर से उस फिल्मिस्तानियों ने बर्बाद कर दिया, जो महेंद्र मिसिर का लिखा हुआ लोकगीत है। उंगली में डसले गया नगिनिया है, हे सखी पिया के बुलाई दे। ये ननद भौजाई का परिहास नहीं है जैसा फिल्मिस्तानियों ने इसे बना दिया। तो ये हम जो स्मृति भ्रंश के शिकार हैं और अपने टेक्स्ट को ठीक से उसके ऐतिहासिक संदर्भों में नहीं समझ पाते हैं कि यह गीत कब लिखा गया, कब कहा गया। मुफलिसी में आटा गीला, किसी गरीब व्यक्ति के घर में ये शब्द रचा गया होगा कि थोड़ा सा आटा था, गूंथने समय पानी ज्यादा पड़ गया, आटा गीला हो गया। अब उसके घर में थोड़ा आटा और है नहीं कि मिलाकर उसको उपयोग के लायक बना ले। ये उदाहरण आप अपने ज्ञान शाखा से लीजिए कि मान लीजिए देवशंकर नवीन 1 बरस के लिए सबैटिकल लीव पर चले जाएं और गंगा साहय मीना को कहीं से वाइस चांसलर बनने का ऑफर आ जाए, वे वहां ज्वाइन कर लें। अब आपके पास न सुपरवाइजर है, न एमए के स्टूडेंट को टीचर है। आप जाएंगे चेयरपर्सन के पास, आपकी चेयरपर्सन कहेंगे कि भाई हमें तो मुफलिसी में आटा गीला हो गया, क्योंकि एक तो हमारे पास वैसे भी 7 टीचर न्यूनतम होने चाहिए, वो नहीं है, जो थे वो भी गीले हो गए। अब आप यहां ढूंढना शुरू करेंगे कि इसमें आटा कौन है, गंगा साहब मीना या देवशंकर नवीन, तो नहीं चलेगा ना। इसके ऐतिहासिक संदर्भ अलग हैं, उसके ऐतिहासिक संदर्भ अलग थे। 2 पाठ के अनुभव एक ट्रांसलेटर को हुआ है और इस तुलनात्मकता से आप इसका जब संदर्भ समझेंगे तब ये बात होगी। मेरा ख्याल है कि मैं शायद कह पाया है, पर आज जो मैम ने कहा है वो विलक्षण बात 2-3 जो हैं, इक्विवेलेंस को आप लोग, नायडा ने भी कोई गलत जगह, उनका उद्देश्य यही इक्विवेलेंस स्थापित करना था, या वो कह चुके हैं कि ऐसा उद्देश्य आप स्थापित कीजिए कि मुफलिसी में आटा गीला वहां क्या था और यहां क्या था। आप ऐसा इक्विवेलेंस नहीं बनाइए कि वहां आटा और यहां आटा। तो इन सब चीजों को जो सुनते हैं, बीच में देखा मैंने 2 बार मैम ने आप लोगों से जानना चाहा जो पिछले भाषणों में इन्होंने कह दिया है, पर उसका जवाब आप लोग दे नहीं पाए, तो इसका जरा ध्यान रखा कीजिए। अगले सवाल के लिए आइए कोई।
एक बात में भी अच्छा मेरे पास है, बस कि मैं सोचती हूँ कि ये जो बाइनरी है कविता और बाकी जो ट्रांसलेशन, जो अनुवाद होता है, ये क्यों करना चाहिए। मतलब हम कविता, ठीक है, जब इसका अनुवाद करते हैं तो कोई खास समस्याएं होंगी, लेकिन आप सोच लीजिए कि एक उपन्यास का अनुवाद कर रहे हैं और उस उपन्यास में भी एक रिदम होगा, एक ध्वनि होगी, मतलब प्रोज में भी ये है। और हो सकता है कि कविता में और ज्यादा हो, लेकिन हर साहित्यिक ग्रंथ में ये होता है। तो आप सिर्फ कविता की बात करते हैं, ठीक है, लेकिन सोच लीजिए कि शायद ये प्रॉब्लम है हर टेक्स्ट के लिए, क्योंकि हम जैसे कि एक ठीक है कविता, मैं गीतांजलि के उपन्यास की बात करूंगी तो उसमें इस तरह के प्रॉब्लम्स बहुत होते हैं कि जो ध्वनि है, जो रिदम है, जो ये सच जो कविता में भी होता है, ये प्रोज में भी, गद्य में भी हो सकता है। तो बस, और कोई प्रश्न है?
With regards to Jhumpa Lahiri, I would just like to go back to one of her short stories, very popular short story, Interpreter of Melodies, wherein she also sort of thinks about translation. And here she sort of conceptualizes translation and the inability to translate as something unsettling. There is a sense of unease, disease, inability to express oneself. And that also recurs again and again in her works like Namesake or the not Wasteland, something else. I'm not remembering the name, right? But Namesake, let us think about Namesake. So she tries to sort of, I'll probably use translate here, the smells, the sensations, the architecture, how one feels. But she is unable to translate or sort of write that in the English language. So when she thinks of emotional translation, is she thinking of something uncanny, something unsettling that is not able to be expressed properly, and translation is sort of the bridge to do that?
Okay, I'm not a scholar of Jhumpa Lahiri, so I don't know what she thinks. And I haven't, really studied Jhumpa Lahiri. I read her Italian writings because I was really curious about that, but I never analyzed. I read the stories, let's call them short novels, whatever they are, but I would not, get into, this sort of. I don't know exactly what she's trying to do in this peculiar text, but for sure, the problem of translating something that is also emotional, it is there, and we will see that, and this is something that is, in any case, part of our relationship with the text, because if you think of translation as the most intimate act, there is a lot of emotion in that, and I will talk about some other definitions of translation that has been done by some Italian translators. So I will come back to this, and so that you must be crazy. Some people think of translation as something that yes, there is equivalence. So it's like a technical thing, but we know that it's something different. The way Jhumpa Lahiri uses the metaphor of translation for literary purposes, I think it's beyond my sphere of
धन्यवाद मैम। एक बार मैम के लिए जोरदार तालियां हो जाएं इतने ज्ञानवर्धक व्याख्यान के लिए। इस बीच जोशिल सर हमारे बीच आ चुके हैं, सर के लिए भी एक बार तालियां हो जाएं। नाश्ता आ चुका है, तो आप सभी नाश्ते के बाद जोशिल सर को सुनेंगे। धन्यवाद।